Congressman Jim McGovern of the 2nd Massachusetts Congressional District recently returned from a trip to Cuba intended to explore opportunities with that country. He discussed the trip and what he learned, as well as his recently introduced bill to expand access to school breakfasts, and talk of impeachment on Capitol Hill with Connecting Point's Ray Herschel.
Well, look, I mean, the president's behavior has been beyond the pale, and the most latest scandal is the news that he reached out to a foreign leader, asked that leader to manufacture dirt on a potential political opponent, potentially engage in a quid pro quo, in this case, withholding military assistance to Ukraine, and and then tried to cover it up, and not cooperating with the Congress. That's obstruction of justice. So, look, I mean, this president thinks he's an authoritarian, dictator, that he's above the law, that that the law doesn't apply to the president. He's wrong. So this inquiry that has been launched by the House is going to be a careful, methodical review of the facts. And then I assume there will be a recommendation to move to a resolution of impeachment, and we will have a vote, yes or no. But that's no different than what happened with Bill Clinton and what happened with Richard Nixon, and I go right down the line.
Now, how soon do you anticipate this formal vote in the House to impeach?
Weeks or a couple of months. I mean, I'd like to have this resolved, before Thanksgiving. If not then before Christmas. There's no need for this to stretch out beyond that. There's more than enough evidence. And there are witnesses that are cooperating, and there are documents that the committees of jurisdiction are getting. So I think this doesn't need to drag into next year.
Good point. And the longer this stretches out in terms of the Democrats and the election next year, when people and Democrats are talking about impeachment, they're not necessarily talking about the issues that they feel they'd like to concentrate on for the election next year. So as this drags on, isn't that going to be detrimental to the Democrats' chances in 2020?
Well, first of all, Democrats and Republicans, as we deal with this impeachment inquiry, need to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. I mean, yeah, there is an impeachment inquiry going on, and there are a couple of committees of jurisdiction that are reviewing the facts. But that doesn't mean that the Transportation Committee can't be working on an infrastructure bill. That doesn't mean we can't be working on a bill to deal with the climate crisis. So we need to do both, and we have been, quite frankly. And we just need to get the news media to pay attention to some of the things that we're accomplishing and that we're passing in Congress. But look, I think we have some great candidates running for president. They're talking about a lot of things, and not just impeachment. And I think they are presenting a better vision for the future than Donald Trump did or could present to the American people.
Now, if this impeachment does get formally voted on in the House and moves on to the Senate, which is controlled by the Republicans, the Senate's not going to vote to remove the president from office. So in the end, what do you think this whole inquiry is accomplishing?
One is to make it clear that there's a consequence for any president, who basically disregards the law, who behaves in a matter that is not only unbecoming of his office, but quite frankly, his behavior has been shameful and disgraceful. And it's not just the issue with Ukraine. I mean, he's, in my view, violating the emoluments clause of the Constitution. He's making money off of his presidency. And it's not just that, it's the Mueller report. So as much as the president wants to say he's been exonerated, that's not what the Mueller report said. So look, sometimes you got to do what is right, and you can't always be worried about the political consequences or about the poll numbers. I have no idea where the polls are going to be next week or next year, but I do know this, that it would be a dereliction of our duty to just sit back and twiddle our thumbs while the president behaves in such a manner.
Speaking of polls, the latest Fox poll indicated that 51% of Americans, the majority, not only favor impeachment of the president, but favor his removal from office. What does that tell you?
Well, that's a Fox poll, right? And Fox is probably the friendliest station to this president. So, I mean, maybe the president will stop watching Fox. I don't know. But I think what it shows is that the majority of Americans get it. They don't feel comfortable with the way this president is conducting himself. In fact, they're appalled.
Congressman, on to other issues now. I want to talk about foreign policy and what's going on in Syria, on the Syrian-Turkish border now, with the president's decision to withdraw U.S. troops from helping the Kurds in that area. We've seen already Turkey starting the invasion and some deaths. People are fleeing. Your thoughts on this change of policy now by the president and what impact that's going to have on the region?
And I'm somebody who believes we should not be engaged in endless wars. Having said that, I also believe, given the current circumstances, that we have to be thoughtful in how we, withdraw our troops. The president is not being very thoughtful. I mean, what he is basically doing is he is, he's withdrawing our forces. Our forces, by the way, were the only thing that was keeping Turkey from going in and massacring all these Kurds. The Kurds have been our allies in fighting ISIS. They have been fighting ISIS so that our troops didn't have to do that. And for the president just to, walk away from that alliance is really, really disturbing. And I think it sends a very dangerous message to all of our allies in the world. You can't count on the United States. I mean, and I don't know what President Erdogan of Turkey has on Trump, but this is exactly what he wants. And by the way, it's exactly what Putin in Russia wants. So I think this is a horrible betrayal of the Kurds. And I think, and what you're seeing in Congress right now is a bipartisan, a chorus of people saying, this is wrong. I mean, it's not just Democrats that are criticizing the president. I mean, people like Lindsey Graham and, Vice President Cheney's daughter, Liz Cheney, have been very, very vocal about what a terrible thing this is.
Yeah, Republicans seem to be speaking out against it as well. Any chance the president might reconsider that decision, or is it too late?
Oh, it's too late. I mean, Turkey's already, as we speak, they're already engaged in, in combat, and people are being killed and murdered, and it really is a sad day for U.S. foreign policy. I don't even know if this president has a foreign policy, quite frankly. But we do know this, that this decision to withdraw U.S. forces in the way he didn't consult with the State Department. He didn't consult with the Pentagon. I don't know who the hell he consulted with. But this is a snap decision, and it's a snap decision that, quite frankly, we're going to live to regret.
Congressman, and on another subject, you recently were a member of a congressional delegation that visited Cuba for, I think it was 5 days. Right. Tell us what the purpose of the visit was and what your observations were in the country.
For many years, I've advocated normalizing relations between the United States and Cuba. I mean, we deal with Russia, we deal with China, we deal with Vietnam. For some reason, we can't deal with this small island 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And I helped persuade President Obama to go to Cuba to begin a new relationship with that country. And I went on that trip with him when he went. So I thought we were on the way to cultivating a relationship where more U.S. citizens could travel there, where U.S. businesses could do business there. And then President Trump comes in, he's reversing the policy. We're going backwards. It's almost as if he's nostalgic for the Cold War, because that's what the old policy was. We had this economic blockade on Cuba for decades, and it didn't do anything except to hurt the Cuban people. And so I went down basically to extend a hand of friendship to the Cuban people and to make it clear that there are many of us in Congress, and I think the majority of people in the United States, who want normal relations with Cuba. I mean, let U.S. citizens be able to travel there. Let our businesses be able to do business there. Let's have a more mature, constructive approach to Cuba.
Another issue you've been heavily involved in is the issue of hunger. And you have co-sponsored a bill that was filed with regard to expanding the school breakfast program for hungry students across the country. Give us an update on that and what the magnitude of that issue is as you see it.
Well, first of all, it's a huge issue. Hunger is a real problem in this country. Over 40 million Americans don't know where their next meal is going to come from. And yet, we haven't done enough to combat it. I always tell people that hunger is a political condition. We have the resources, we have the money, we just don't have the political will. One of the places to combat hunger is in our schools, to making sure our kids have access to good, nutritious breakfast and lunch. My bill would expand access to breakfast for many kids, because that meal, that breakfast or lunch, is every bit as important to that child's ability to learn as is a textbook. If you're hungry, you can't concentrate. And we need to have a discussion in this country about making nutrition more of a topic of discussion. I mean, not only in terms of combating hunger, but in terms of health care, in terms of dealing with a whole range of health challenges that are out there, and in terms of lowering health care costs as well.
What's your anticipation in terms of moving this bill forward now and getting it passed?
My hope is that we can pass it in the House, and we do have bipartisan support. I don't know what will happen to it in the Senate, nor do I know what would happen if it reached the President's desk. But this is an issue near and dear to my heart. As you know, I do this march with Monte Belmonte every year, the Monday and Tuesday before Thanksgiving. We begin in Springfield, and we march all the way to Greenfield. My legs are hurting already when I think about it. But we raise money for the Food Bank of Western Massachusetts. And that hunger is an issue in Western Massachusetts. And it's not just in urban areas. It's also a problem in rural areas where people don't have access to food banks and food pantries. And quite frankly, in the United States of America, with tens of millions of people hungry, we all should be ashamed. This is something that is solvable and fixable, and we need to do it.